Imagine a world where the mountains whisper ancient secrets, the rivers carry the voices of ancestors, and the trees stand as silent witnesses to centuries of history. This is the world of Korean folklore, a realm where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural blur, and where every element of the landscape holds a story. In the mists of time, long before the establishment of kingdoms and the advent of written history, the Korean peninsula was alive with myths and legends. These stories were not mere entertainment, they were the lifeblood of the people, offering explanations for the mysteries of nature, guiding moral conduct, and providing a sense of identity and unity. At the heart of these tales lies Dangun Wangyam, the legendary founder of Gojoseon, the first Korean kingdom. Born from the union of Hwanum, the son of the heavenly god Hwanin, and a bear-turned-woman named Umya, Dangun's story is one of perseverance, divine will, and the deep connection between humanity and the divine. But Dangun is just one figure in a rich tapestry of myths that populate Korean folklore. From the mischievous dokkabi, goblins who test human wit, to the graceful gumiho, nine-tailed foxes who navigate the complexities of love and identity, these stories reflect the hopes, fears, and values of the Korean people.
As we journey through these ancient tales, we'll uncover the profound truths they hold about the human condition and the enduring spirit of the Korean people. We'll explore how these myths have shaped Korea's cultural landscape, influencing everything from art and literature to modern-day beliefs and practices. So step into the world of Korean folklore, where every story is a window into the soul of a nation, and every myth carries the weight of centuries of tradition and wisdom. If you've made it this far into the journey, I can't help but feel like you're just as captivated by these ancient Korean tales as we are. But here's the thing. If you're not subscribed yet, I have to ask, why not? You've already invested your time, and we're about to dive even deeper into these myths that have shaped Korea's very identity. We'd really love to hear from you in the comments. So, if you're watching from somewhere far and wide, please let us know where you're tuning in from. We're genuinely curious about the global reach of these stories, and it's always exciting to see where our community is watching from. And for those of you who haven't subscribed yet, we'd be so grateful if you could take a moment to tell us why in the comment section below. What's holding you back? We truly value your feedback, and it will help us improve. We'd love to hear your thoughts and make this channel something even more special for you. So, drop a comment, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep this journey going, together.
Imagine stepping into a world where the land beneath your feet isn't just solid earth, it's alive. A world where every mountain, every river, even every tree holds a spirit, a god, or a force that guides the very fabric of existence. Long before the rise of kingdoms and the written word, Korea was a place where the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual weren't just blurred, they were non-existent. This was a time when early Koreans didn't merely coexist with nature. They were an inseparable part of it, woven into its fabric, bound to its mysteries and powers. Picture this: the rivers, not just bodies of water, but living beings that carried the voices of ancestors, the whispers of the gods, and the very breath of the earth. The mountains, towering above with a kind of silent majesty, weren't just impressive landscapes, they were seen as the very throne rooms of deities, places where the spirits of nature held court and dictated the fate of the people below. The trees? More than just plants. They were sacred, holding within them the wisdom of generations, sometimes ancient beings who could speak, guide, and protect. In this world, the line between the physical and the metaphysical didn't exist. Everything was imbued with a kind of spiritual power. But this wasn't just some fanciful belief system. This was reality for the early Koreans. They didn't just worship nature, they became part of it, performing rituals to maintain balance, paying respect to the spirits of the land, and ensuring the survival of their people. These beliefs formed the very core of Korean identity, the lens through which Koreans understood the world, their place in it, and the forces that governed their lives. This worldview gave rise to Muism, the indigenous shamanistic religion of Korea, and at the heart of Muism stood the Mudang, female shamans who were not just healers or mediums, but spiritual leaders, mediators between the human and spirit worlds. The Mudang weren't just revered, they were essential. In a world filled with unseen forces, the Mudang had the power to negotiate with gods and spirits, performing rituals to ensure a good harvest, invoke protection, or cure the sick. They were the gatekeepers, the ones who ensured that the spiritual balance was maintained and that the invisible forces of nature didn't turn against the people.
But what exactly did it mean to be a Mudang? What powers did these women hold? Imagine a woman who could stand in front of a mountain spirit, face to face with a god, and speak on behalf of an entire community. This wasn't just some abstract power, it was life or death. The spirits could be unpredictable, demanding sacrifices, rituals, or intense devotion. One wrong move, and a community could find itself cursed, its crops destroyed, or its people struck by disease. The Mudang's task was monumental, to ensure the survival of their people by appeasing and negotiating with forces far beyond their understanding. But what happens when these forces are no longer appeased? What happens when the spirit world turns its back on its people? But the role of the Mudang was not just about negotiating with gods. It was about maintaining order in a chaotic world, one that didn't just exist, but was alive, a living, breathing entity governed by spirits who could bless or curse with equal force. These shamans didn't just call on the spirits when needed, they lived alongside them. The rituals they performed weren't mere acts of ceremony, they were acts of survival, of living in harmony with the world around them. And what was the result of all this spiritual interaction? The stories, the myths that have survived for centuries. These weren't just tales. They were the fabric of Korean culture, the blueprint for understanding the world, society, and one's place in the universe. These early stories were filled with gods, spirits, and legendary figures, each one a reflection of the spiritual world that governed their lives. For instance, consider the bear woman who, through a divine trial, transformed from an animal into a human, a key myth that would later shape the foundation of Korean identity. These stories laid the foundation for a deep connection between the people and the land, where every element of the natural world had a story to tell, and every story had a spiritual lesson.
But as we go deeper, the real question emerges. How did these beliefs influence Korea's future? As time went on, Korea would face foreign influences, Buddhism, Confucianism, and, eventually, Christianity, all of which would challenge the ancient spiritual practices of Buddhism. What would become of the Mudang and their ancient rituals when these new systems of belief swept across the land? How would shamanism, so deeply rooted in Korea's early identity, survive? Or would it be erased forever? And so, the stage is set. From this deep connection to the land, to the powerful women who acted as spiritual mediators, to the myths that would define an entire nation, Korea's earliest beliefs would become the seed of its future. But what happens when ancient traditions are confronted with the forces of change? How do these beliefs evolve when the world around them starts to shift and the battle between the old ways and new ideas begins? The answers to these questions lie ahead, and trust me, you'll want to see what happens next. Imagine standing on the very soil that birthed a nation, the land that was shaped by a goddess, a woman whose very existence brought the earth to life. Long before Korea became a kingdom, before written history ever existed, there was a myth that explained the creation of the land itself, a myth that still echoes through the mountains and rivers of modern Korea. This is the legend of Margot Helmae, the Earth Mother goddess, and one of the oldest and most vivid myths in Korean folklore. Margot wasn't a distant, ethereal being who merely wove creation from afar. She was hands-on, tangible, and deeply connected to the earth. According to legend, she shaped the landscape of Korea with her own hands, carrying mud in her skirt, molding it to create mountains and valleys. But here's the truly remarkable part. She urinated rivers into existence, using her own bodily functions to create life.
Yes, you heard that right. A goddess creating rivers through bodily functions, a strikingly human and deeply feminine act of creation. Think about it. In an age when most creation myths around the world were dominated by male gods who wielded thunder, swords, or fire to shape the world, Margot Helmae's story is not just an act of creation, it's an act of nurturing. Her actions tell us something profound. The power of life, creation, and sustenance doesn't just belong to the gods of war and conquest. It is tied to the female form, the very essence of nature itself. Now, why is this significant? Let's break this down. In ancient creation myths from cultures all over the world, male gods often wield their power with violence. Storms, battles, and flames are common tools. Yet, Margot's myth stands out in stark contrast. She creates not with force, but with life-giving, nurturing energy. Her ability to shape the land and give life to rivers with something as personal as her bodily functions is an incredibly sacred act. In a way, her myth redefines creation. It's not about domination, it's about sustaining life. But Margot Helmae's role goes far beyond the act of shaping rivers. This Earth Mother goddess isn't just a creator, she is the embodiment of life's cyclical nature. Consider the metaphor. Just as rivers carry the flow of life through the land, so too does the feminine embody the cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. Margot's rivers aren't just rivers, they are the lifeblood of Korea itself. And with her, the spiritual connection between women and the land becomes clear. Women have always been the keepers of life, the guardians of Earth's cycles, whether as mothers, creators, or caretakers. Now let's consider how Margot Helmae's myth positions women in the broader spiritual framework. In a time when patriarchy and male deities dominated many of the creation myths of other cultures, Margot's role was radically different. She wasn't a secondary figure or a supporting character in a male-driven narrative. She was the central force. Women were revered not only as nurturers and givers of life, but as spiritual equals to the male gods, carrying the power to shape the world through their connection to the earth. Could this myth suggest that women in early Korean society held a unique spiritual power, one that was as vital to the survival of the nation as the physical land itself? Margot Helmae's sacred connection to the land, her shaping of rivers and valleys, offers a powerful reflection of how early Koreans saw the relationship between women and nature. Women, like Margot, were the ones who gave life to the land, and the land in turn gave life back to them. How might this spiritual bond between women and the land have influenced their status and role in society? Were early Korean women seen as not just caretakers of the home, but as sacred figures with the spiritual authority to shape the world around them? And if so, how did these early myths reflect the real-world authority of women in these ancient societies? As we peel back the layers of this myth, we start to uncover a deeper truth. The connection between women and the land was never just physical. It was spiritual, profound,
and rooted in Korea's very identity. In Margot Halme, we don't just find a goddess of creation, we find a symbol of female power, an enduring reminder of a time when women were revered as the Earth's creators. This wasn't just a symbolic myth, it was an essential cultural belief, passed down through generations, laying the groundwork for Korea's future.
But the question lingers. How did these myths evolve over time? How did Margot's story and the powerful image of women as earth-shapers survive and adapt as Korea's spiritual landscape shifted? What happened to the status of women as the influence of Confucianism grew stronger and more patriarchal systems took root? To answer these questions, we have to look at the sweeping changes in Korean society and the tension between the old beliefs and the new. But stay with us, because the answers to these questions may challenge everything you thought you knew about Korean mythology, society, and the role of women in the ancient world. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Imagine a time when a king wasn't just a ruler, but a living connection between heaven and earth, a time when a nation's very foundation was rooted in the divine, in the belief that the ruler was not only chosen by the people, but also ordained by the gods. This is the story of Dangun, the legendary founder of Gojo-sen, the first Korean kingdom, whose birth marked the beginning of a dynasty and whose myth would shape the very soul of Korea. Dangun's origin story isn't just another tale of divine favor, it's the very foundation of Korea's identity. Born of a celestial god, Hwanung, and a bear woman, Eungnyo, Dangun's birth is steeped in symbolism. This wasn't just a meeting of flesh and blood, it was a union of heaven and earth, an intermingling of the divine and the earthly, a blending of spirituality and humanity that would forever define Korea's view of kingship. Imagine that, a king, a nation's first ruler, coming from the very divine realm itself. He is not just a leader, he is a symbol of divine will brought to life, standing at the crossroads of human power and celestial authority. Dangun's story begins with Hwanung, a heavenly prince who descends from the heavens with the 3 heavenly seals, divine tools of authority, bringing with him the power over wind, rain, and clouds. But Hwanung's descent wasn't just a visit, it was a cosmic mission. He was sent to establish order on Earth, to teach humanity the ways of civilization, agriculture, law, and ethics. But there's more to the story. Hwanung's union with Eungnyo, a bear transformed into a woman, isn't just an origin story. It's an embodiment of cosmic order, the merging of divine and earthly realms, the very essence of unity between heaven and earth. Dangun, born of this union, isn't simply a king, he is the living manifestation of that unity. This birth isn't just about establishing a bloodline, it's about establishing a divine mandate. Dangun, born in 2333 BCE, is not just Korea's first king, he is its first divine ruler, the first of a long line of kings whose right to rule comes not from military might or political maneuvering, but from celestial authority. The very foundation of Gojo-sen, the first Korean kingdom, is laid not by human hands, but by divine will. Dangun's reign wasn't just about governance, it was about establishing a sacred order that would define Korea's political landscape for millennia to come. Let's pause here and think about the symbolism behind Dangun's origin. This is where things get fascinating. Dangun's birth story is much more than a myth. It's the story of divine legitimacy. From the very beginning, the bloodline of Korea's rulers is seen as something sacred. Divine ancestry doesn't just legitimize Dangun's rule, it justifies the entire political structure of the nascent kingdom. In the ancient world, where kings often claimed their authority based on their military prowess, divine myths, like Dangun's, created a different kind of foundation, one that rooted the nation's identity in the celestial realm itself. But the story doesn't end there. As we move forward in time, we begin to see how this myth, the very foundation of Korean kingship, has evolved. Dangun's legend is considered Korea's foundational myth, so important that it is celebrated annually on October 3rd, National Foundation Day, marking the official beginning of the First Korean Kingdom. This day isn't just a holiday, it's a reminder of the nation's divine origins, a day that serves to reinforce the national spirit and the belief that the Korean people are, in some ways, the descendants of the gods themselves. But here's where things get even more intriguing. As we fast forward to the modern era, we see how Dangun's mythic legacy has been reinterpreted and sometimes manipulated for political purposes. Take North Korea, for instance, a nation that has used Dangun's divine lineage to bolster its own political legitimacy. North Korea has even claimed to have discovered Dangun's tomb, using this mythic connection to promote the idea that the nation's strength is rooted not just in its modern political institutions, but in a line of divine rulers dating back thousands of years. What does this tell us? It shows that Dangun's legacy is not static, it's flexible. It evolves with the needs of the times. Dangun's symbolism has been harnessed by political regimes to solidify power and legitimize authority. In North Korea, the myth of Dangun has been revived and reinterpreted as a tool of national pride. But is this true to the spirit of the original myth? Or has it been manipulated to serve the purposes of a modern regime? And how does this reimagining of Dangun's legacy impact our understanding of Korean identity today? The tension between ancient myth and modern politics raises another profound question. How does a nation's mythic past influence its present? Can myths like Dangun's still serve a national purpose even in the modern world? Or has their political power diminished in the face of a globalized, interconnected world that often questions the validity of ancient legends? The answers to these questions are as complex as the story of Dangun itself. But what we can say for certain is this: Dangun's myth is not just a relic of the past, it is a living, breathing symbol that continues to shape Korean identity, from National Foundation Day to the modern political landscape. Dangun's story has evolved, but at its core, it remains a symbol of divine kingship, of the eternal connection between heaven and earth. And now we're faced with one final question. What does the future hold for the legacy of Dangun's myth? How will modern Koreans continue to interpret and adapt this ancient story in the years to come? Stick with us, because we are about to take a deep dive into the future of Dangun's legacy and how myths like his will continue to shape Korea's national spirit for generations. You won't want to miss what comes next.
Imagine a world where the gods themselves walk among men, and the very foundations of nations are built upon divine birthrights. The Three Kingdoms period of Korea, spanning from the 1st century BCE to the 7th century CE, isn't just a story of kings and queens, it's the story of gods giving rise to kingdoms, where every ruler carried within them the divine mandate to govern. The foundation myths of the kingdoms of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla aren't just allegories, they are the spiritual core of these kingdoms, justifying their rule and their destiny. This era was not just about military might or political alliances, it was about legitimacy. Each kingdom, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, was built on the belief that its founders were divinely chosen, their rule ordained by the heavens. These kingdoms did not simply rise through conquest or diplomacy. They rose through divine will, and their leaders were not mere men, but descendants of gods. These divine foundations became the very heart of Korea's cultural and spiritual identity, shaping the way the Korean people viewed leadership, power, and destiny. Let's take a deeper look at the founding myths of the three kingdoms and how they set the stage for the unification of Korea under the Silla kingdom, a unification that was as much about spiritual alignment as it was about political dominance.
Let's begin with Goguryeo, a kingdom that would rise to become one of the most powerful states in East Asia. The story of Jumong, the founder of Goguryeo, is nothing short of epic. According to the Samuk Sagi, Jumong's birth was nothing less than a miracle. He was born from a celestial egg, a son of a river god and a celestial being destined to be a leader of gods and men. His divine origin didn't just give him power, it justified his claim to rule over Goguryeo. Jumong's birth from an egg wasn't just a sign of divinity. It marked the beginning of a kingdom's rise, a kingdom that would stretch across the Korean peninsula and into Manchuria. Jumong's origin myth, as extraordinary as it is, was more than a personal story. It became the foundation of the Goguryeo identity, a symbol of divine kingship that elevated his bloodline above all others. Goguryeo's rise wasn't just political, it was spiritual. The kingdom's kingship wasn't inherited simply through family connections, it was sanctioned by the gods. This myth, Jumong's egg-born birth, wasn't just for show, it was the cornerstone of Goguryeo's claim to heavenly legitimacy. And it's fascinating how such a divine birth story became the bedrock of one of East Asia's most formidable powers. But Jumong's reign wasn't just a peaceful rise to power. It was marked by struggle, betrayal, and strife. Jumong's divine favor didn't prevent him from facing enormous personal challenges. He was exiled early in life, cast out by his adoptive father, and had to fight and unite various tribes to establish Goguryeo. Divine birth didn't guarantee peace. It demanded courage, resilience, and the ability to overcome adversity. In many ways, Jumong's myth tells us as much about the human condition, the struggle for legitimacy, as it does about the divine right to rule.
Next, let's turn to the Silla kingdom, which occupies the southeastern part of the Korean peninsula. Like Goguryeo, the Silla kingdom was founded on a divine myth, and it too was imbued with celestial significance. The story of Hokkyukuse, the first king of Silla, is no less miraculous. Hokkyukuse was said to have been born from a celestial egg, descended from the heavens, and bathed in the divine light of the sun. His birth wasn't just a sign of divine favor, it was a cosmic event that signified Silla's future dominance. The kingdom of Silla might not have had the same geographical power as Goguryeo in its early years, but Hokkyukuse's celestial origins gave the kingdom the spiritual authority to rise. His divine birth tied Silla's future kingship directly to the gods. In a way, the Silla kingdom's rise was foretold, marked by the heavenly egg, which indicated that the kingdom's rulers were ordained by divine forces. This wasn't simply about military conquest, it was about the divine will being made manifest in the world. This divine right to rule played a crucial role in Silla's unification of the entire Korean peninsula in 668 CE, a monumental moment in Korean history. The kingdom's unification wasn't just political, it was a spiritual unification, where the heavenly mandate granted to the kings of Silla was fulfilled. As Silla expanded, it wasn't just conquering lands, it was fulfilling a divine prophecy,
one that tied the future of Korea to the gods. So here's a question for you. Which kingdom's founding myth do you find the most intriguing? Is it Jumong, the egg-born son of a river god, destined to found the mighty Goguryeo? Or is it Hokyukusei, born from a celestial egg, heralding the rise of Scylla under the divine light?
Comment below, and let's dive into the symbolism behind these divine origin stories. How do these supernatural births reflect the values and aspirations of these kingdoms? What does it say about how these kingdoms viewed the relationship between kingship and divinity? But the myths don't end here. As we've seen, these divine origin stories shaped the political and spiritual legitimacy of the kingdoms. But what happened when these myths collided? What happened when Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, each with their own divine mandate, began to compete for dominance over the Korean peninsula? How did the battle for divine legitimacy shape the political landscape of Korea? And how did these myths serve to justify the conflicts that arose between them? Korean folklore as state building. Picture this. A nation built not just on land and armies, but on the belief in divine forces, spirits, and myths. A time when the power to rule wasn't just about the crown, it was about divine approval. Welcome to the Goryeo dynasty, where Korean folklore wasn't merely a cultural artifact. It was a tool used by the state to build a nation, forge an identity, and legitimize the rule of its kings. This wasn't just about myths told around a fire or in temples. These stories, legends, were the bedrock of political power, the glue that held the nation's fabric together. Korea's mythology has always been deeply rooted in nature and the divine, but when the Goryeo dynasty rose to power in 918 CE, it ushered in a new chapter. Buddhism wasn't just a religion, it was the state religion, and with it came a profound transformation. The ancient shamanistic beliefs that had long been the backbone of Korean folklore weren't pushed aside. They were woven together with Buddhism, creating a new, powerful narrative that would redefine Korea's national identity for centuries. But how did this fusion of Buddhism and shamanism create the powerful spiritual framework that helped the Goryeo dynasty rule? And what role did ancient myths play in the state-building process? Get ready. This isn't just a tale of kings and gods. It's about how mythology became a weapon, a tool of power, shaping the political and spiritual destiny of a nation. To understand the power of this transformation, we need to look at how Buddhism came to dominate the Goryeo dynasty. Before Buddhism became the state religion, Korea's spiritual landscape was dominated by shamanistic beliefs, spirits of nature, gods of rivers and mountains, and ancestral deities who were worshipped and feared. But when Buddhism entered the picture, it didn't erase these beliefs. It blended with them. The Buddhist monks didn't just teach about the Buddha, they embraced the spirits and gods of ancient Korea, making them part of the Buddhist narrative. And at the heart of this transformation stood Irion, a Buddhist monk who played a crucial role in preserving Korea's ancient myths. Irion didn't just preserve Buddhist texts, he understood the importance of Korean folklore. He knew that these legends, these myths, were vital to understanding the nation's identity, its spirit, and its future. So Irion compiled the Samuk Yusa, a collection of myths, stories, and historical accounts that blended Buddhism with the shamanistic beliefs of ancient Korea. This wasn't just a religious document, it was a state-building tool. The Samuk Yusa preserved the divine origins of Korean kings, the legends of gods, and the spirits that guided the land, weaving them into the Buddhist framework that was shaping the future of the Goryeo dynasty. These weren't just stories, they were the spiritual legitimacy of the rulers themselves.
But here's where the twist comes in. What happens when a nation's identity is built on myth? What happens when divine legitimacy is intertwined with statecraft and every move a ruler makes is backed by the gods. This is where the Goryeo dynasty didn't just rely on military might, they relied on the power of myth. They weren't just the rulers of a kingdom, they were the living embodiment of divine will. And this myth wasn't just for the royals, it became the backbone of the entire nation, a shared belief that united the people under one banner. But as powerful as these myths were, they didn't always stay consistent. What happens when new rulers take power? Can they rely on the same divine foundation, or do they reshape the myths to fit their own agenda? In the years following the rise of Buddhism, the Goryeo dynasty faced internal struggles and external threats. Could the same myths that helped establish the kingdom also be used to justify its decline? And as Korea's myths became more politicized, what was the true role of folklore in a changing world?
Close your eyes and imagine walking through a village on a crisp autumn night, the fog rolling in, and the only sounds you hear are the whispers of the wind. In the distance, you hear a faint cry. It's the sound of spirits. In Korean folklore, the supernatural wasn't something to be feared. It was a force that shaped everyday life, guiding people through the turbulent waters of good and evil. From the ghosts seeking vengeance to the spirits delivering justice, the supernatural world wasn't just a backdrop for stories, it was a reflection of the real world. These weren't mere ghost stories meant to entertain around the fire. No, these spirits had a purpose. They balanced the scales of morality and justice in a world governed by Confucian values, where laws were strict, and sometimes even the earthly rulers couldn't enforce fairness. But how did these spirits maintain the balance between right and wrong? And why was it so crucial that supernatural forces played such a central role in early Korean society? Let's take a deep dive into the world of ghosts, spirits, and mischievous creatures whose powers were woven into the very fabric of Korean society. These were not just ghost stories, they were lessons, warnings, and calls to action, shaping the very moral compass of ancient Korea. One of the most iconic ghost stories in Korean folklore is that of Aron, a virtuous daughter who was tragically murdered unjustly. Arong's tale isn't just a ghost story, it is one of Korea's most significant cultural narratives, etched into the consciousness of the Joseon dynasty and continuing to resonate today. Arong's death and her undying spirit speak to the core values of justice, honor, and retribution, values that were especially important in a society where Confucian ideals governed social behavior. The story of Arang goes like this. Arang, the daughter of a magistrate, was murdered in cold blood by a man in power. But her story doesn't end with her death. Arang's spirit refuses to rest, seeking vengeance against her murderer. Her ghost, undeterred by death, haunts the land, seeking justice for the injustice done to her. In her quest for justice, she appears to the new magistrate, who takes it upon himself to uncover her killer and set things right. The story isn't just about revenge, it's a call to action, reminding people that justice, even if it means rising from the grave, must always be served. But why does Arang's spirit refuse to rest? Because in a Confucian society where the respect for authority and hierarchy was paramount, Arang's story becomes a symbol of moral defiance, a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. The spiritual intervention of Arang in her father's quest for justice shows that when the earthly realm fails to deliver justice, the spiritual realm can step in to correct the wrongs. Arang's ghost, far from being a simple haunting or terror, becomes a moral guide. Her tale is about ensuring that justice prevails, even when human systems fail.
In this world of supernatural interference, it wasn't just gods and spirits who shaped the course of history, it was their influence over human affairs. And this was more than entertainment for the people. It was a spiritual order, an intervention that ensured that the natural order, rooted in justice and honor, was maintained. But Orang's tale is just one of the many stories of ghosts and spirits who played an active role in balancing the scales between right and wrong.
Now, let me ask you, what do you think of the role of ghosts in Korean folklore? Are these supernatural beings just old stories passed down to scare children, or do they carry deeper lessons about justice, morality, and balance? How do these tales, filled with vengeful spirits and moral tests, reflect the values of modern society? Are they still relevant today, or have they faded into the past? But Orang's story is just the beginning. The world of supernatural beings doesn't end with vengeful ghosts and restless spirits. There's a whole army of mythical creatures, each with its own role in keeping the balance between good and evil. From the mischievous Dokkaebi, who play tricks on unsuspecting travelers, to the deadly Gumiho, a nine-tailed fox that lures men to their doom, these creatures don't just haunt the folklore. They shape the very actions of the people who encounter them. But what happens when these creatures move from the realm of myth into the real world? How did they influence not just personal behavior, but national politics, warfare, and the very structure of Korean society?
Imagine a time when the very identity of a nation wasn't just forged through military conquests or political alliances, but through the tales of gods, spirits, and heroes. A time when these stories weren't passed down by books or digital media, but by word of mouth. Each generation carrying the stories, keeping them alive, and ensuring they shaped society. Now picture that world transforming as the oral traditions that shaped a people's very identity were suddenly captured in writing, giving those stories new life and a new purpose. This is the world of the Goryeo dynasty, 918 to 1392, where for the first time Korea's ancient folklore and mythological stories were no longer just passed down around fires. They were captured in written texts, preserved for future generations. The rise of the written word didn't just change how these stories were told, it changed their impact on the nation itself. The Goryeo dynasty recognized that folklore wasn't just entertainment, it was a spiritual and political tool, one that could unite the people, legitimize the throne, and preserve the identity of the state. How did this transformation from oral to written folklore take place? What did it mean for the future of Korea? And who were the figures that made sure these ancient myths would live forever, shaping the very fabric of the nation? As we explore this transformation, we need to understand the cultural and political significance of preserving these ancient tales during the Goryeo dynasty. Before the rise of written folklore, Korea's cultural identity was passed down orally by storytellers and shamans, in villages and courts, in temples and palaces. These myths weren't just for entertainment, they were the spiritual backbone of the society. They connected the past to the present and provided a shared understanding of the nation's origin, its gods, and its heroes.
When King Gwangjong, 949 to 975, took the throne in the Goryeo dynasty, his political consolidation required more than just military strength. It needed a unified national identity. And so, the Goryeo rulers saw the power of mythology. They realized that oral traditions, while powerful, could be easily forgotten or distorted over time. Buddhism, the state religion under Goryeo, had already embraced the power of written texts to preserve its teachings, so it made perfect sense for the state to formalize the preservation of Korea's ancient folklore. These stories were no longer just private myths. They were part of a public narrative that could be used to reinforce royal legitimacy and spiritual authority. This shift from oral tradition to written texts marked a monumental change, not only in how these stories were preserved, but in how they shaped society. The idea that myths and legends could be captured in writing and thus become immutable gave these stories an almost sacred quality. They were no longer fluid, shifting with each telling. They were etched in stone, part of the official record of the nation. At the heart of this transition stood Irian, a Buddhist monk who played a pivotal role in preserving Korea's ancient folklore through his monumental work, the Samguk Yusa. Irian wasn't just a scribe, he was a guardian of myth. His work was not just about recording stories, it was about shaping the future. Irian understood that Korean folklore was not just a collection of entertaining tales. It was the core of the nation's identity, a set of beliefs, values, and traditions that tied the people to their gods, their ancestors, and their kings. By recording these myths, Irian helped ensure that they wouldn't just survive, they would thrive.
The Samguk Yusa, completed in the 13th century, became one of the most significant documents of Korean cultural history. It is a compendium of myths, legends, and historical accounts, ranging from gods and spirits to the foundations of kingdoms. Irian's work didn't just preserve Buddhist teachings, it preserved the soul of Korea's spiritual and political history. Through the Samguk Yusa, he recontextualized these myths, blending them with the Buddhist worldview, and made them a central part of the national identity. Irian's role was more than just historical recording. He was shaping the future of Korea's cultural landscape. By combining Buddhism with shamanism, he was not just preserving stories, he was redefining them for a new age. These ancient stories, now recorded in written form, would live forever, influencing the people, the culture, and the kings for centuries to come. But the question remains, what impact did this rise of written folklore have on the people of Goryeo? Were these newly written myths simply tools of the state, used to enforce royal authority? Or did they still speak to the common people, offering them guidance, hope, and morality? And what happens when Buddhism, with its written texts, begins to challenge the older, more mystical beliefs rooted in shamanism and nature? The written word gave these myths power, but did it also change their meaning? How did the evolution of written folklore influence not only the people of Goryeo, but the entire future of Korea's spiritual landscape? As we journey further into the rise of written folklore in Korea, we will explore how Irian's work impacted the next generations and how myths, legends, and spiritual beliefs continue to evolve. Stay tuned, because the legacy of written folklore doesn't just end with Goryeo. It continues to shape modern Korea in ways you might never expect. You won't want to miss what comes next. Picture this. A society where the official state religion doesn't just govern how people live, but how they think, feel, and even dream. Now imagine a time when a foreign belief system begins to take root, so deeply that it begins to replace the spirits of the land, the gods, and the ancient myths that had once been the heartbeat of the nation. This is the world of the Joseon dynasty, 1392 to 1897. Where Neo-Confucianism became the dominant force, shaping not only the state's political and social structures, but the very spiritual beliefs of the people. But here's the thing. Despite the rigid Confucian ideals that sought to silence them, the old ways, the shamanic practices, the ghost stories, and the spirits of the earth didn't just fade away. They didn't vanish. In fact,
They took on new life in ways the Confucian state couldn't control. These supernatural tales became more than mere entertainment. They became subversive, critically examining the very moral authority of the ruling elite. The spirits didn't just haunt the night, they haunted the ideals that the Joseon dynasty tried to impose on its people. So, how did the spirits and ghosts that were pushed to the margins continue to influence the heart of Joseon society? How did these ancient supernatural tales evolve from being whispered in the darkness to being preserved in written records, ensuring they would survive centuries of state-imposed repression? Let's unravel the story of how the Joseon dynasty's quest for order and control couldn't completely suppress the ancient voices of Korea's folklore. The Joseon dynasty, while revered for its political stability and cultural achievements, brought with it an era of spiritual and ideological control. The Neo-Confucian philosophy was more than just a moral compass for governance. It was the foundation of everything, from the structure of the family to the nation's social order. But as Confucianism became entrenched in the court, it set out to marginalize Korea's shamanic traditions. The old beliefs, the spirits of the mountains, the gods of the rivers, and the deities of nature were seen as chaotic, irrational, and dangerous to the strict social order that Neo-Confucianism sought to maintain.
Under Confucian doctrine, even ghosts and spirits were relegated to the margins, portrayed as superstitions or distractions that needed to be controlled. The elite and the ruling class viewed these beliefs as primitive, things that belonged to a less civilized age. Shamanistic rituals were outlawed, shamans were forced underground, their practices becoming secretive and rebellious. Yet, despite this repression, the spirits didn't disappear. The people's need for justice, moral guidance, and spiritual connection remained. And it was during this period that the ghost stories, the hauntings, and the mysterious spirits of old became a quiet form of rebellion against the state's imposition of order. Tales of spirits didn't just entertain, they became a subversive form of resistance. They subtly critiqued the elite, exposed the moral flaws of the ruling class, and reminded people that there was still a world beyond the physical, a world beyond control. At the heart of this preservation was a remarkable figure, Young In, a scholar of the 17th century, who understood the critical need to document the spiritual landscape of Korea at a time when oral traditions were being eclipsed by state-sponsored doctrine. Young In recognized that while the elite and Confucian philosophers were determined to suppress these supernatural tales, they were still alive, hidden perhaps, but still vibrant in the hearts of the common people.
Young In's work, Yadam, became the defining document of this spiritual resistance. It wasn't just a collection of ghost stories, it was a preservation of Korea's mythic soul. Through Yadam, Young In ensured that the stories of spirits, vengeful ghosts, and shamanistic traditions would be remembered and transmitted for generations to come. Yadam was more than a literary work. It was a spiritual archive, a direct challenge to the Confucian suppression of the old ways. In a society where spirituality was being carefully regulated, these stories became subtle critiques, mocking the moral failures of the elite, showing that the truths of life were not confined to the Confucian order, but instead flowed through the gaps in the system, where the spiritual world still had the power to correct the wrongs that the earthly realm could not. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. As Young In and other scholars like him preserved these tales in writing, the written word became more than just a record of the past. It became a living force, breathing new life into the old myths. But what happened when the ghosts, the spirits, and the supernatural beings of Korea's folklore were captured in written text? Did they retain their power, or did they lose something essential in the process? Were they simply preserved as stories, or did they continue to resist the state's imposition of order? And as we look at the long-term consequences of this shift from oral folklore to written record,
We must ask, how did the stories of spirits and ghosts influence the social fabric of Joseon Korea? Did these supernatural tales affect the political landscape, undermining the authority of the ruling elite and shaping the cultural consciousness for generations to come?
We're about to dive into the lasting legacy of these supernatural tales and how they shaped modern Korean culture in ways you might not expect. Stay tuned, because the spirits are still alive and their influence stretches far beyond the pages of Yadam. The true story of their power is only beginning to unfold. You won't want to miss what's coming next.
Imagine walking through the bustling streets of Seoul, surrounded by the modern, cutting-edge world of skyscrapers, neon lights, and technology. Yet amidst this modern marvel, you can still feel the presence of something ancient, something supernatural, a force that has traveled through centuries, influencing not just Korean culture, but the very spirit of the nation. The spirits, gods, and myths that once filled the air of ancient villages continue to breathe life into the modern-day Korean consciousness. They still shape the way Koreans view the world, their relationships, and even their politics. In this digital age, Korean folklore has been reborn in K-dramas, films, and literature, captivating audiences not just in Korea, but across the globe. From supernatural thrillers to romantic dramas, the ancient stories of gods, spirits, and ghosts that once bound the Korean people together are now being broadcast to millions around the world. But here's the question: why does Korea's folklore continue to hold such a deep, powerful influence? How did these myths, once told around fires in small villages, evolve to captivate the global audience today? And more importantly, how do these ancient stories continue to shape the very fabric of modern Korea, from political discourse to social movements? Let's uncover how Korea's mythical past continues to weave its influence through the present, shaping a nation and captivating millions beyond its borders. To understand the continuing power of Korean folklore, we need to look back to its origins. The myth of Dangun, the legendary founder of Gojoseon, is not just the story of a god-king born of heavenly descent and a bear woman. Dangun's tale is a foundation myth, one that has been woven into the very identity of Korea itself. It is a myth that has lasted for over 2 millennia, serving not only as a spiritual origin story, but also as a political tool. Even today, echoes of Dangun's divine kingship reverberate in North Korea, where figures like Kim Il-sung have claimed a direct ancestry to the legendary king. This connection to Dangun isn't just symbolic, it's political. The myth of Dangun continues to serve as a tool of legitimacy for modern political regimes, providing the North Korean leadership with a sense of divine right to rule. This connection to Dangun's divine legacy wasn't just a historical footnote, it is still very much a part of the political discourse in modern Korea, influencing not just the North, but also South Korea's relationship to its past. But the influence of Korean folklore isn't just political, it's deeply cultural. The same mythological foundations that helped define Korea's national identity are still actively shaping the way Koreans view their world. And as we move into the modern era, these ancient stories are now the backbone of one of the world's most beloved entertainment exports. In today's Korea, myths and spirits don't just belong to the past, they are alive, kicking, and dominating pop culture. The global phenomenon that is K-dramas is one of the most fascinating places where Korean folklore continues to thrive. From the supernatural romance of Goblin to the otherworldly intrigue of The Legend of the Blue Sea, the myths of Korea, once whispered among the common people,
are now broadcast to millions worldwide. But why do these supernatural stories still resonate so deeply with both Koreans and international audiences?
The answer lies in the universal themes that these myths explore: immortality, justice, vengeance, and the eternal battle between good and evil. These are the same themes that ancient Koreans grappled with when they first told their stories around fires, and they're the same themes that continue to resonate today. But there's also a more subtle layer to these supernatural dramas. They often hold up a mirror to modern society, exploring themes like social inequality, family loyalty, and government corruption through the lens of the supernatural. The spiritual world may have been pushed to the margins by Confucian rulers, but it has found a new, powerful voice in the entertainment world, one that speaks directly to the modern Korean experience. The spirits that once haunted the palaces of Joseon, Korea, now fill the screens of Netflix and Viki, teaching us lessons about morality, justice, and the consequences of unchecked power. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. How deeply does the influence of these myths run in modern Korean life? Are they simply entertainment? Or do they still hold spiritual power over the everyday lives of Koreans? Can the ghosts and spirits of the past continue to affect political movements, social reforms, and even personal beliefs? And in this age of globalization, how does Korea share its supernatural tales with the world without losing their core meaning?
Step back into the world of ancient Korea, a world where the spirit realm and the earthly realm intertwined so seamlessly that the line between gods and humans was almost imperceptible. Imagine a world where the tales of divine kings, vengeful ghosts, and spiritual beings were not only part of everyday conversation, but were also the foundations of society. These weren't just stories told to amuse children or explain natural phenomena. They were essential codes that shaped the Korean identity, its values, and its morality. Even in modern Korea, these ancient stories still pulse through the veins of the nation. From the rise of K-dramas to the political rhetoric of leaders invoking divine heritage, Korea's folklore is alive, not just as a reflection of the past, but as a driving force in the present. These supernatural tales, once told around a fire or in the courtrooms of kings, now fill the screens of the world's most popular TV shows and movies. But here's the real question. Why do these ancient myths continue to have such a profound impact on modern Korea? How did Korea's folklore go from oral tales passed down through generations to a global phenomenon that reaches millions? And most importantly, what role do these myths play in shaping Korea's future, politically, socially, and culturally? At the very core of Korea's folklore lies a powerful spiritual identity that has influenced not only the people's worldview, but their social structures and national identity. The myth of Dangun, for example, isn't just a tale of a divine king born from a heavenly god and a bear woman. It is the myth that legitimized the concept of divine kingship and statehood in Korea. This myth has echoed across dynasties and continues to influence political discourse in modern times, particularly in North Korea, where Kim Il-sung used his claimed descent from Dangun as a means of justifying political power and asserting national unity. This blending of folklore and politics didn't end with the reign of ancient kings. It continues to shape modern political leaders and public narratives. Even in South Korea, where the myth of Dangun still plays a symbolic role, we see the reverberations of divine legitimacy within the public imagination. What does this tell us about the relationship between myth and power in modern Korea? How do ancient myths, once the foundation of kingship, continue to influence national politics, cultural policies, and identity in a globalized world? Today, Korean folklore has become an indispensable part of the country's popular culture. With the explosion of K-dramas and K-pop, the supernatural elements that once resided solely in the oral tradition have now been reimagined and repackaged for global consumption. Series like Goblin, which is steeped in Korean spiritual beliefs, showcase ghosts, spirits, and deities as both cultural artifacts and modern-day critiques of society. But this isn't just about entertainment. It's about how these stories still function as tools for reflection and social commentary. Through Korean dramas and cinema, ancient myths are reinterpreted to engage with modern issues, from social inequality to family loyalty and government corruption. These supernatural tales, while fictional, serve as moral lessons, teaching audiences about justice, revenge, and balance. For example, in dramas like The Tale of Nokdu, the supernatural moral code and just retribution tied to Korean folklore are central themes, driving the narrative and reflecting modern Korean values. The spirits and gods of old aren't just mere symbols, they are living forces that guide the nation.
But why is it so important that folklore has made such a huge comeback in the digital age? How did these ancient stories, once relegated to the margins by Neo-Confucianism, find a new cultural resurgence in the global entertainment industry? The answer lies in the emotional power of folklore. These stories aren't just about entertainment, they are about identity. They are the lifeblood of Korean culture, still relevant because they speak to universal human themes: the battle between good and evil, honor, revenge, and the quest for balance. In today's Korea, where modern issues seem to collide with ancient wisdom, folklore offers answers, not just for Koreans, but for people around the world seeking meaning in a rapidly changing world. But here's the twist. How will the ancient myths of Korea continue to shape the future of a nation that is rapidly modernizing, becoming a global powerhouse in technology, business, and cultural influence? Can folklore, which once served as a way of defining morality and political legitimacy, continue to provide guidance in the 21st century? What role will spirits and gods play in an era dominated by digital technology and scientific progress? Is Korea's folklore evolving to meet the needs of modern society? Or is it beginning to fade as globalization and technology continue to take center stage? If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the power of Korea's folklore, its enduring influence, and its impact on the modern world, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an exploration of the rich stories that have shaped cultures across time. Leave a comment below and let us know how you think these ancient myths still influence today's global society, whether in politics, entertainment, or culture. Which legend resonates most with you? We'd love to hear your thoughts and continue the conversation. And as always, thank you for being part of this incredible journey through history, myth, and the supernatural. See you in the next video.